now we are going to listen to Anthony Pagden, who is professor in the departments of political science and history at UCLA. Professor Pagden is the author of numerous works on the political theory of empire, and I will mention here The Enlightenment and Why It Still Matters, published in 2013, and The Burdens of Empire in 2015, and his most recent publication goes Beyond the Enlightenment, and which will appear very soon, he hopes, next month, entitled The Pursuit of Europe, a History, which is a sort of long duration reconstruction of the European project. But for today, please join me in welcoming Anthony Pagden on Women, a Civilizing Presence.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia, indeed. So we're sharing the same computer for technical reasons, so she's been... So, as Julia has argued, a sea change in the perception and status of women, and above all female-male psychology, takes place in what we generally call the Enlightenment. In part, this is due to the widespread, although Julia points out very rightly, not by no means universal collapse of the hitherto hegemonic concept of natural law based upon the existence of, that is a natural law based upon the existence of innate ideas. What in part replaces this, as to say the Aristotelian neoclassic, neo-scholastic version of that natural law, what in part replaced this was a broader and vaguer notion of what was called a common or moral sense in English, which was believed to be the basis of that sociability, what Samuel Pufendorf called socialitas, without which, as he pointed out, the human race would never, would have long since perished. Now, under this rubric, all people shared in this equally, and so did both sexes. The question was then, why, if we assume that both sexes are in this way equally endowed, do they in fact occupy such radically different positions in society? It was a question which could not be disaggregated from the question as to why certain peoples and races occupy such radically different position in the world to others, although I'm not going to discuss that, of course, here. For most in the 18th century, the answer, as with all matters concerning the new science de l'homme, was to be found primarily not in nature, but in history. Women were not intellectually inferior to men in the ways that Aristotle and the neo-Aristotelians believed, as Julia has described it. That is, they were not lacking in either intellect or decisiveness or both. They did, however, occupy an inferior position in the social hierarchy. For many, that had been the consequence not of an innate disposition, but of human social evolution. For most of the writers of the Enlightenment, all human societies are believed to evolve through 4 different stages, the famous 4 stages theory. The hunter-gatherer, the pastoralist, the agriculturalist, and finally what Adam Smith, who of course is one of the principal and most influential architects of this scheme, called the commercial society. The hunter-gatherer stage, in which the task of subsistence and survival had fallen entirely to men, had created an inescapable distinction between the robust male and the nurturing female. The survival of the species relied upon Aristotelian tumos, but this had no real bearing on the intellect. It did, however, place women who had not only to suffer the often lethal process of procreation, childbearing, menstruation, and the menopause, all of which was something which male writers of the 18th century dwelt on at length, in a position of dependence, and that had created a condition of subjugation. It was, however, one that was recognized to be cultural and not natural. This distinction survived throughout the pastoral and agricultural stages of society, although at each stage the position of women improves. The process, however, by no means an uninterrupted one. Smith, for instance, believed that the condition of women was reversed when, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe reverted to the agricultural mode of production. Now, but then finally we come to modern commercial society. Now the situation changes radically. The 3 previous stages all been ones of relative social isolation and insistent warfare. In the 4th, however, what Montesquieu famously calls sweet commerce replaces war. In the modern commercial society, It is not sheer force or brute courage that animates the polity, but the capacity to communicate and to persuade. War thus becomes a relic, in Benjamin Constant's phrase, a heritage from distant ages. In the future, declared the Marquis de Condorcet, to whom Julia rightly gives a crucial role in her story, and I will come to in a minute, in the interconnected, civilized, global world of the future which he envisaged, I quote, the system of laws and education would render the virtue of courage almost useless. In such a world, the status of women would be, or should be, fully equal to that of men. If a modern society is to survive and prosper, it has to learn to be what in the 18th century was called polite and polished, a complex process which involved debate, discussion, and education. And it was generally agreed women were far better at civilizing and polishing than men. There was, it must be said, nothing very new in this perception of women's character and abilities. The image of the civilizing, calming female, of course, goes back to antiquity, as we've already heard, and Julia has discussed this at some length in an earlier publication. The difference is that now women are no longer merely calming and civilizing individual males, they are calming, polishing, and civilizing entire societies. It was thus, as David Hume phrased it now, I quote, on the free intercourse between the sexes, that the politeness of a nation will commonly much depend. Women therefore emerge as the new civilizers. Now, as Hume described it, women, I quote, flock into cities, love to receive and communicate knowledge, to show their wit or breeding, their taste in conversation or living, in clothes or furniture. Both sexes meet in an easy and sociable manner, and the tempers of men, as well as their behavior, refines apace. Women, as William Alexander, the author of a sometimes condescending but also remarkably prescient history of, as he significantly phrased it, quote, the progress of women from slavery to freedom, unquote, had been formed, quote, with a beauty and tenderness sufficient to soothe us into softer behavior. On this account, women are not inferior to men by their nature. It is the long history of subjugation which has made them so. What Hume called, I quote, this sovereignty of the male is, he said, a real usurpation and destroys that nearest of rank, not to say equality, which nature has established between the sexes. Diderot, in his posthumously published Sur les Femmes of 1772, makes a not dissimilar claim, as did the German materialist, the Baron de Holbach, in his own Des Femmes of 1773. It was by then something of a commonplace, and it should be said that it was not one restricted to the cozy cosmopolitan world of Britain and France. Diderot and Hume, of course, were both frequent guests at the dinner parties held by Holbach in his home in the Rue Royale. At the other end of Europe, both geographically and at the time intellectually, the Spanish Benedictine, Benito Jerónimo Feijó, who despite his professional undoubted faith was, as in respects in many others, one of the most enlightened men of the century, pointed out sarcastically that all the books written about women over the centuries have been written by men, and that, I quote, if the women had written them, it would be we, the men, who would have ended up underneath. After having examined all the evidence at great length, he came to the conclusion that if women knew far less than men and had achieved less than men, although even this was not universally so, and he provided innumerable examples from ancient history of societies in which it was the women who had been the philosophers, the scientists, and the rulers, Artemisia, of course, among them, this certainly did not prove that they were less able than men. All it meant was that they had been given less opportunities by men. If men, he asked, I quote, dedicated themselves to nothing else but agriculture, as the illustrious Thomas More suggests in his Utopia, so that they knew nothing else, would this then be grounds for saying they were capable of nothing else? Now, the arguments used for claiming that women were inferior to men and thus denying them equal status with men, as Voltaire and many others pointed out, were closely tied to the continuing existence of the slavery of Africans. And just as ridding the world of slavery was, as Condorcet put it, a necessary condition for the future evolution of humanity, so too was the emancipation of women. For most of the enlightened also firmly believed that the humanity, the civility, the decency of a society and its likely contribution to the future advancement of the species could be measured by the ways in which it treated its women. The, quote, the rank and condition in which we find women in any country, wrote William Alexander, quote, mark out to us with the greatest precision the exact point in the scale of civil society the people of such a country have arrived at, and were their history entirely silent on every other subject, and only mention the manner in which they treated their women, we would from thence be unable to form a tolerable judgment of the barbarity or culture of their manners. This, at least, is one of the legacies of the Enlightenment that I think is still very much with us. In a somewhat grudging response to these arguments, women during the 18th century came to acquire positions of individual responsibility and to exercise personal freedom in ways they had never achieved before. True, these were generally restricted to the wealthier and better educated, but then so too, however, was, however we define it, the Enlightenment. They were the mistresses of the salon. They were, say, the women like Jean d'Alembert's mother, the novelist Claudine Garin de Tinsin, or the abiding love of d'Alembert's own life, Jules Lépinasse. There were also those who were literary and scientific figures in their own right. There was famously Voltaire's mistress, Gabrielle Émile Marquis de Châtelet, Newtonian and mathematician. Voltaire called her the Minerva of France, but also said of her with characteristic bitchiness that she was, I quote, a great man whose only fault was being a woman. And there was Condorcet's wife, of course, Sophie de Grouchy, who's collaborated widely with her husband and translated Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments into French, to which she added 8 letters of sympathy on her own. But, and there is always a but, for the uneasy, suspicious male, there also lurked a danger in all this civilizing and polishing, for too much gentleness and civilization raised the spectre of the great 18th century fear of luxury. Civilization could become a process of feminization, and the feminine both beckoned and alarmed. It improved and refined, but it also, or at least it was feared, weakened. Taken to extreme, the polished manners of the commercial society could tip over into indolence, latitude, frivolity, and ultimate decay, or at least the inability to confront any threat from beyond the limits of the civilized world by unrefined and unpolished males. Similarly, while Diderot may have preferred, as he famously told his friend, correspondent and lover Sophie Volant, refined vice under a suit of silk than stupid ferocity beneath an animal skin of the kind worn by Rousseau's virtuous Hottentot, he could never quite escape from the fear of the excesses of the immorality or that women supposedly encouraged, immorality is his phrase, and which led inevitably to debilitating corruption luxury. In the final version of Sur les Femmes, he proposed his own version of the 4 stages theory by adding a 5th and future stage, the age of gallantry. Here men become excessively civilized and under the sway of female immorality, cease to be productive, fall into idleness, and finally bring the whole order down with them. In Diderot's view, this was evidence that the ultimate submission of women to men was both natural and necessary. An equality of intellect did not suppose an equality of social and political status, or even an equality before the law. For the same reason, Hume was prepared to argue that because of the, quote, inferior strength, body and mind, although quite what he meant by strength is not clear, of women, men, quote, should not, properly speaking, lie under any restraint of justice with regard to them. And when compelled to contemplate the possibility of a matriarchal society, he declared indignantly that any such thing was an absurdity, since, I quote, it gravely exalts those whom nature has subjected to them, that is to men, and whose inferiority and infirmities are absolutely incurable. None of the great women of the 18th century occupied any kind of position of authority within society. Women might now perform the invaluable task of civilizing and polishing, on which future health of the nation, as Hume suggested, now depended. They might be accomplished thinkers, even scientists, but this did not confer upon them the right to occupy the same place within a social or legal hierarchy, let alone political order as men. For although men might not be in any way inferior to men, they were certainly very different. Above all else, they had to submit themselves to those hardships associated with procreation, menstruation, childbirth, and the menopause, that long, dangerous disease, as Diderot called it, and which had then been allowed to occupy positions of legal or political, which, had they been allowed to occupy positions of legal or political authority, would frequently have made them incapable of carrying them out adequately. It also made them inescapably dependent, if not always, then certainly at crucial moments in their lives, on men. Not dissimilar views, it need hardly be said, survive to this day. Women were also, of course, in the eyes of most, however enlightened, first and foremost mothers, and as such responsible for the propagation of the species. The subject of great concern in the 18th century, when many, including Montesquieu, believed that the population of Europe had shrunk to the point that it was now less than it had been in antiquity. Quite apart from their intellectual and physical capabilities, women could not be taken out of this crucial function in order to carry out others which men could perform without their allotted role in the process of procreation being diminished in any way. In the end of the 18th century, that is, the perceptions of the intellectual capabilities of women had been radically transformed, but the supposition of their necessary dependence upon men and their naturally subordinate role in political life had changed very little. In this respect, the most significant change, which, as Julie has argued, alters the entire subsequent direction of the argument over the status of women in society, comes with Condorcet. For Condorcet, what mattered was not law or jus, as it had been understood by the just naturalists, but rights. Women supposed immorality, their potential for corruption, their disposition to luxury were, he believed, predominantly male fantasies. True, women had different interests to men, but he argued on giving men the rights of citizenship, sur la mission des femmes au droit de cité of 1790. All this, even the claim that they were, I quote, more gentle, more sensitive, less subject to those vices which proceed from egotism and hardness of heart, yet do not really possess the sentiment of justice, that they obey rather than their feelings, rather than their conscience. All of this was, in Condorcet's view, due again to education, not nature. It was thus entirely beside the point. And as for such things as the suffering of women from the rigors of childbirth or the menopause, of which Diderot and others have made so much, although they may have been more extreme, were they, he asked, as Julia has pointed out, any the less mentally and morally debilitating than the gout and bronchitis from which men habitually suffered? And a brief history of the role of women that women have and might have played in public life, compared with that of certain men, had left him convinced that, I quote, in looking back over the list of those who have governed the world, men have scarcely the right to be so very uplifted. The rights of men, he concluded, I quote, results, by men he means mankind, yeah, humankind. The rights of men result simply from the fact that they are rational, sentient beings, susceptible of acquiring ideas of morality and of reasoning concerning those rights, those ideas. So women having then the same qualities have necessarily the same rights. Either no individual of the human species has any true rights, or all have the same. And he or she who votes against the rights of another, whatever may be his or her religion, color, or sex, has by that fact abjured his own. Yet never in any so-called free constitution had women been given the right of citizenship in order to exercise it, and this, in his view, was precisely what the new French Republic should now grant them. It did not, of course. As Julie has argued, democracy has not been very good for women. And when Alante de Gorges had the temerity in 1793 to write a declaration of the rights of women to match the Declaration of the Rights of Men of 1789, she ended up under the guillotine for being, I quote, a virago and a woman-man who had forgotten the virtues of her sex. It would take another century of persistent struggle to establish Condorcet's argument as a principle of justice, and then in faraway New Zealand.
Well, thank you, Anthony.